Good evening to everyone who's joined us today. I will not take much time. I'll just introduce the three speakers that we have and the moderator for today, and then Saqib, who's the moderator, will take over. So the session today is titled National Education Policy 2020, and we have three speakers with us. We have Professor Surajit Majumdar, who teaches at Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have Professor Nandita Narayan, who teaches at the Delhi University, and we also have with us Comrade Aishi Ghosh. Aishi is the president of the Jawaharlal Nehru University Students' Union and is also a research scholar there. And the moderator for the session will be Dr. Saqib. Saqib is a member of Anveshan and he is an independent researcher. So, Saqib, over to you.
Thank you, Pranav and Anveshan. Last week, we saw that the Union Cabinet approved the National Education Policy 2020. And since then, there has been a lot of debate, and it has opened the NEP. The approval of NEP has opened a can of issues with regard to the whole education system in the country. And we saw that the NEP has come up with sweeping and fundamental changes and reforms with respect to both school education as well as the higher education in terms of curriculum to entry and exit options, students, to regulation and things like that, so on and so forth. And we have also seen that it has several contentious issues and problems, the policy itself, and which has already been opposed by several student organizations as well as teachers unions across the country. And to throw light more on these issues, we have Professor Surajit Majumdar and Professor Narayan from Delhi University, and Professor Nandita Narayan from Delhi University, and Aishi Ghosh from JNU. So it will be Professor Majumdar who will start today's session, followed by Professor Narayan and then Aishi Ghosh. I would request the speakers to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then after each speaker has spoken, we will have a round of question and answer. So over to Professor Majumdar. He'll be the first to go.
Sir, you'll have to unmute your audio.
Sorry. So thank you, Saqib, and thank you, Anveshan, for this invitation to share some thoughts on the National Policy on Education 2020, which, as everyone knows, was adopted by the Union Cabinet on 29th July, just a little over a week ago. I'd like to begin by saying that given some of the kind of discussions that have happened around this policy from many people who may not be otherwise favorably inclined towards the government, I think it's important to emphasize that the National Policy on Education is firstly a political document. And as such, if it's a political document, of course, it comes with what is par for the course in politics, where it is formulated in language and cast in a certain mold, which does not necessarily reveal what its real character is. And therefore, it doesn't always help to get lost in the nitty-gritty. If you miss the wood for the trees, okay, you don't necessarily properly analyze that particular document and what it means. The second point I want to make is that it is not just a political document, but it is a document or a policy that is coming in a background where, no matter how you look at it clearly, India is standing at a crossroads. Okay, a crossroads which has been shaped by a set of tendencies, economic, political, social, okay, and stands at a very important conjuncture in its history. It is from that conjuncture or that context that this document or policy emerges, and it is supposed to be or designed to be an intervention in that context. And therefore, there is no way one can understand this merely by a textual reading of what is there in the policy. Unless you place it in that context and understand what it means, you cannot really get a grip on what the policy is. Now, I will try and lay out, or from such a perspective, try and present a reading of this document. But I shall do so with a slightly unconventional method. My presentation will have 3 parts, after which there will be some concluding comments. The first part would be to try and highlight the key features of this current conjuncture and how have they reflected themselves in the sphere of education. The second part would be trying to present what, or to glean out from the document what its underlying philosophy is. Okay, the general kind of philosophical outlook that underlies this particular document, the National Policy on Education, the final version as it has come. And the third part, I'll just use a kind of analogy to illustrate the kind of model of education that this policy is trying to put forward. And I'll sum it up with some, I'll try to link these 3 parts at the end. The political nature of the document itself is in part illustrated by the changes that have happened between the original draft as it was prepared by the Kasturirangan Committee in 2019, which then was converted into a shortened 55-page National Policy on Education 2019 draft, which was on the MHRD website. On the day that the policy was, it was announced that the cabinet has adopted, there was one version of the National Policy on Education 2020, a file named National NPE Final for Circulation, which apparently from the MHRD was put into circulation. There was on 24th, however, there was another document in circulation which was 83 pages extracted from a longer 187-page document, which was also in circulation. And on 30th, finally, the MHRD put up a final document, which is the National Policy on Education 2020, which as of now is the actual official document. If you look at this journey and the changes that have happened right up to the last moment in this, there itself some of the indications of the kind of document it is are illustrated. So Nandita would of course be very familiar with this, that in the original draft of the National Policy on Education prepared by the Kasturirangan Committee, almost 500 pages in length. Okay. And people please mute. It's a little difficult if some people start speaking in between. Okay, so in that original document, quite a favorite expression of the authors of that document was liberal education. I actually did a count. It appears some 86 times in the original draft. Okay, and even in the truncated 55-page version that the MHRD had, it appeared about 15 or 16 times. Okay. What was described as liberal education in that document remains as the model in the final National Policy on Education. But the word liberal obviously is not particularly liked by the government. So it's been more or less eliminated from the final version. Okay, so now liberal education is described by an alternative expression, multidisciplinary and holistic education, which is there in the original draft also. It's not that it's fundamentally different, but the particular expression used to describe it, liberal education, has been almost entirely eliminated. It appears only in one sentence now in this document. That's one example. There's another example that the original draft and right up to the final document before the 30th document came up on the website, in the section dealing with foreign languages that would be promoted. I mean, secondary students would be encouraged to learn foreign languages. There was an illustrative list of languages in which Chinese was there. But at the last moment, Chinese is removed. As if, even if you've declared China an enemy country, your best way of dealing with it is you be ignorant about what that country. Okay, so that kind of a thing is there. So that's the second illustration of the kind of things there. But there are other important things that have also been removed in the final document, which one needs to keep in mind. So the Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, or the National Education Commission, which had been proposed as the apex body for Indian education, led by the Prime Minister, that was there in the original document, original draft, is not present in the final document. The idea of having an Indian education service, which appeared in between, which would be part of the Indian bureaucracy and from which registrars would be appointed of universities. This idea was not part of the original draft, it appeared in between, but again, it's gone missing in the final version. Okay. So the final version also reflects some of these things where things have been left open-ended. It doesn't mean that the dangers have gone. It means that things have been left open-ended, and open-ended things are also ways in which you keep your options open to do things which you don't want to spell out right now. Okay. So there are these changes that have happened, which in my view illustrate the role of political calculation that has gone in the shaping of the final draft. The original draft itself was prepared by a politically selected committee of academics and educationists. It was not some spontaneous outcome of from the Indian academia. Okay, so this is illustrative of the importance of trying to read and interpret the document carefully in relation to the current context. So what are the defining features of the conjuncture or the context in which this policy has emerged? If you look at the domain of the economy, there are two things that are important. One is that you are now standing at a point at which a 3-decade-long process of movement in the Indian economy, in which you have seen a massive increase in the economic polarization, in the inequalities in society. Okay, that trajectory is today in the midst of a deep crisis. So you've had that history and you have that in a state of crisis at the moment. A crisis that does not originate in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a crisis that existed before, okay, and has only become worse with the COVID-19 pandemic's effects. What is that crisis? If you look at that particular trajectory of development, in that trajectory of development, the concentration in the ownership of wealth and the distribution of income has increased massively, where basically the top 10% of the Indian population and the corporate sector, these two overlapping categories, have monopolized or cornered all the advantages or benefits of growth, okay, leaving 90% of the Indian population behind. So the pattern of increase in inequality that has been witnessed in India is for 90% of the Indian population, there has been fairly high degree of stagnation of incomes at pretty low levels, and therefore very little scope to accumulate wealth, while the top 10% has cornered most of the gains and therefore also been able to accumulate more wealth out of the high incomes that they have got. And these two processes are related because ultimately in the process of the generation of the income in the production process, it's the 90% whose labor is involved And because the part that goes for as return to laboring activity is low, that's why the return to those who have assets or property is higher. Okay, so the two have been related processes that have happened. This has had a certain relationship with the employment scenario, where if you look at it, that there has been a category of high salary white collar employment that has got created in this process, which didn't exist on the same scale before the 1991 economic reforms. In fact, you couldn't have such kind of employment because of the laws at that time. Ceilings on what you could pay at even in the corporate sector there existed. So you have had a creation of a category of high salary white collar employment, and sections of the middle class therefore who are part of this 10% have also benefited from that. However, for the large majority, okay, if you look at the overall employment situation, what you've had is very little employment being generated, and therefore you have a situation where for large part of the population, they are stuck between open unemployment, underemployment, which is they don't get enough work. Okay, the two in combination have also meant permanent withdrawal from employment, seeking itself for large sections of the population, particularly women. If you then get work also, no matter what kind of work it is, the return that you will get, whether it's self-employment or wage work, the return you will get is very low, because you're in a context where there are few employment opportunities and many takers. And that's what has held down the wages and incomes and the returns to labor for the 90% and allowed the top 10% to grow and benefit. That's been the economic trajectory, but that contradiction itself has run into, created a problem there, where it's not possible to sustain that process of expansion because the market has become too narrow in relation to the wealth that is ultimately accumulated for the purposes of accumulating further wealth. So there's a squeezing out of profitable investment opportunities that has happened as a result of this particular kind of trajectory of development. An associated element of this economic trend has been that as far as government's policies of taxation and expenditure are concerned, they have never been used. Part of this policy context is they have not been used to redress this increasing inequality, but in a sense facilitate it. And part of that process has meant that you don't tax heavily, you don't spend heavily. Okay, governments don't tax too much, governments don't spend too much. Okay, we have enshrined it into the constitution that the fiscal deficit has to be low in the form of the FRBM Act. So the taxes to GDP ratio, despite its increasing inequality, have remained almost stagnant. Short period in which it increased, it was only used to reduce the fiscal deficit. So public expenditure to GDP ratio has remained pegged at the same level for 3 decades. Okay, and the solution to the crisis that is being sought to be found is not a solution which is going to use public expenditure to reduce inequality, widen the market, or expand the market on the basis of which this problem can be addressed. It is through opening up more and more possibilities for private investment, making it more profitable through lower taxes, more profitable through giving them greater opportunity to reduce the burden of wages, okay, or what has to be given to labor. So in a sense, it's an attempt to find a solution to the crisis, which is about aggravating the very same inequalities which have ultimately produced or resulted in this crisis. Okay. The implication of this for Indian education has been what? The implication for education has been that the education system has been transformed or changed over these 30 years, and particularly in the last 20 years, driven by 2 processes. One is an increasing demand across all segments of society for an education. Middle class families with a history of education have aspired for these high salaried white collar employment opportunities that have been available, and therefore they have wanted their children to learn, and often at a greater expense. They're willing to pay more for that because of higher incomes, access to credit, etc., willing to pay more than what had been spent on the education of the previous generations. Amongst those where there isn't large segments of society which have historically been disadvantaged economically, socially from accessing education, even amongst them, this economic reality has produced a condition where the only possible route that they could see to any form of economic and social mobility was via education. And therefore, the demand for education, even amongst sections of society where there has not been a history of education, has increased. Okay, so people want their children to be educated more than they may have themselves been, and they're all willing to pay more for that, even at the expense of suffering some hardship. This demand for education has not been, increased social demand for education would not be met by an expansion of public investment in education because of the overall stagnation in public investment. So public investment in education has not kept pace with this increased demand for social demand for education. And what you basically get is a private sector stepping in to exploit that. Okay, not through creating a large system in which everyone is able to get. There's a hierarchy within that private sector also, who gets what kind of education. But private sector has taken advantage of this, which has resulted in an extremely high degree of privatization of the Indian education system, which had already happened before the National Policy on Education 2020 was adopted. So if you look at the figures for enrollment, 45% plus of 45% plus of college enrollment is in private unaided colleges. Another 20% in private aided colleges. In professional courses, 70% plus of undergraduate enrolled private institutions. Alongside this process of private, even in the case of universities, where the private sector component is still low, it's only about less than 1/5. In the last few years, if you see, from 2014-15 onwards, 55% of the increase in enrollment in universities has been in private universities, and another 33% in public open universities, not in the regular universities. 88% therefore of the increase in university enrollment has happened in private or public online distant learning institutions, not in the regular public universities. So this is the already established high degree of privatization of the Indian education system that has happened. Okay. Now, so and therefore it has meant that the cost of education has become very high, and this has had, despite the increases in enrollment, despite the widening base of enrollment in education, social base of enrollment, has had an effect of making the access to education unequal. So inequality in access to education, however, has taken several forms. One is that you don't get an education because it's too costly. You can't enter. After a certain, at whatever stage, you can't enter. One set of people get denied access in that way. Second is those who manage to enter do not necessarily get the same education. It depends on how much ability you have to pay, how much resources you have, whether you will get a good or a poor education. Okay. And if you did manage to still get that education, what economic opportunities had opened for you? Even in there is an inequality. And the privatization has actually meant that effectively through the privatization of education and increasing the cost of education, we have made education as an instrument of regressive taxation, where the poor have to pay a larger proportion of their incomes to ensure that their children get educated. This is a regressive system of taxation that we have introduced. So this is the trend of what has happened in education, which has accompanied the process of increasing inequality in the economic domain. Okay, and as this process has unfolded, as the crisis has unfolded, okay, the sustenance of this kind of a process politically has also faced challenges. And India's democracy, India's secular democracy, maintenance of that structure of democracy and this kind of a process has increasingly become difficult. And therefore, for the beneficiaries of these things, it has also become necessary in different ways to undermine India's secular democracy in several different ways. And what we have seen is this concerted attempt to undermine democracy and establish a particular regime that is there today in power. We're using its power, using the support of those who are economically and socially dominant. Okay, everything being used to try and ensure that this is the permanent regime in power in India. Okay, and the permanent regime, which then is able to use that power to circumscribe the rights of the majority to be able to question in any way this particular polarizing trajectory in India. So this is the conjuncture in which this particular policy comes. And what one must ask is, does it at all challenge this conjuncture? Or is it something that is part of the response to dealing with that crisis by carrying that process of inequality, carrying that process of erosion of India's secular democracy further? Okay, that's the question, that's the way in which I think it should be looked at. Now, if one looks at the document, so the second part I want to come to is the underlying philosophy. If you look at that document and its vision of where India is going and what education is supposed to play in that process. So the future of the world in this document is the fourth industrial revolution. Understood in this document in an extremely narrow, simplistic sense as a process in which the development of technology will eliminate most of the manual, unskilled work that people do today, and the jobs of the future will be the jobs which have to be done by people who have many different skills in many different disciplines and have a highly creative ability. So the jobs of the future will be done by not those who have learned, but those who have learned how to learn. Okay, so that's the future of the world. So the more complex understanding of the fourth industrial revolution as a process, technological change-driven process in which the physical, the biological, and the digital world are all getting fused into each other, and which is something which has potential but also has dangers within it. That complex idea doesn't figure. It's just that this is the jobs of the future, and the job of the Indian education system must be to create the people appropriate for that, because it is India's destiny to rise to the position of a world leader, become a global knowledge superpower, become a Vishwa Guru once again through its participation in the making of this fourth industrial revolution. So how is that to be achieved? How does Indian education become capable of performing this function of helping India? Must draw inspiration from ancient Indian knowledge and ancient Indian tradition for this. Okay. How so? By first imbibing what was the underlying philosophy of ancient Indian knowledge tradition, which was multidisciplinarity and holistic education. This is the requirement of the modern world. And we have to now discover that this was our ancient knowledge tradition, which will help us in finding our place in the world of nations in the modern world. So the modern world needs that multidisciplinary holistic education, which was the ancient Indian tradition. Ancient Indian knowledge and knowledge systems are also a treasure trove of knowledge waiting to be discovered, which have got lost or forgotten, and which must be extracted and built on to create the knowledge of the future. Okay. And ancient Indian traditions, Indian values must also be promoted. There is no conflict between Indian values, as firstly there is one set of Indian values, and there is no conflict between them and constitutional values. All of those would be promoted together. Okay. And through this process of education, we have to recognize the common Indian essence that links all of us to an ancient Indian past, in which the medieval period is a irritant. There's an ancient and there's a modern. There's no medieval. Repeatedly, this kind of a formulation you will see. So we have to link up to that ancient past and recognize that there's a common Indian essence across the length and breadth of this country, which goes back to that ancient Indian past. And while we have linguistic diversity, many different languages spoken, there is a certain central unity to those languages also. Okay. So we are a linguistically united country also, because there is a common Indian essence to all of India's languages, and the education system must promote that sense of Indianness and an Indian identity. Okay. This is the context in which the importance of Sanskrit, because that ancient knowledge exists in Sanskrit. Sanskrit was the language of that. This is the background in which also the question of mother tongue is emphasized, not for its scientific value in learning. Nandita says my volume is a volume come down.
It's fine actually. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question of Sanskrit, the importance of Sanskrit, as well as a classical language, and the importance attached to mother tongue in this policy also is derived from this kind of a philosophy, not from the scientific outlook that mother tongue is the optimal medium of instruction for optimizing the learning of students. Okay. So this is the philosophy on which this whole policy is supposed to be built. Now, what is the model that they come up with of Indian education? This most closely fits higher education, but there's a similar model in school education. And I'll give an analogy to illustrate that, after which I'll make my concluding remarks. Okay. So imagine an industry producing mobile phones. Okay. There's an industry where mobile phones are produced. There are several different companies which are selling these producing and selling mobile phones. There are some which are private corporate companies, some which are public sector. The public sector ones have different degrees of disinvestment of their shareholding to private sectors. Someone has 10% in private, some has 20%, some has 30%. They are public sector, but part of their shareholding is private. And some of these companies are also foreign owned and controlled. Each one of these companies sells mobile phones. Each one of these companies has a brand. Under that brand, they sell a range of phones. Okay. A range of phones which are from high end to low end, from low price to high price. Okay. There's a range of such products that are offered by each. Why? because the market in which they are selling these phones has that differentiation. There's a high-end part of the market, there is a low-end part of the market, there's a middle part, ground in the market. So according to people's ability to purchase, a product is available from the basic phones to the high-end phones. Okay, that is offered by each one of these. Okay, so each one has a brand name, and some of them sell only in India, some of them sell also abroad. Each company is run by a management. If it's public sector, appointments committee of the central government appoints the managers of these public sector enterprises. If it's private, it is typically some family or someone, some group of closely knit individuals who pass on the management control from one generation to the next. Okay. And then there are some foreign companies which are affiliates of foreign multinationals who are determine who their management. So each has a management, okay, and subject to some minimum laws like minimum wage and all of that, they decide what kind of compensation packages are to be given to their employees, what kind of hierarchy must exist between them, between the different categories of employees, what were the terms on which they will be employed. All of this is decided by them. What range of products they can offer, the terms on which they employ, the pricing of these products, etc., is not controlled by anyone. They are all free to decide. It's all worked out in the market. Okay. What you have, however, is some rating agencies which will give ratings to these companies, their financial health, etc., as well as to their products. You have something like a Bureau of Indian Standards which says this phone has ISI mark, this phone does not have ISI mark. Okay, they do this. So they have this. Such standards are set. Okay, so while nothing is controlled in terms of pricing and the kind of products they offer, there are government regulations. There are government regulations which ban the use of Chinese apps on these phones. Okay. There are government regulations which insist that there must be apps which play bhajans every morning, must be there on every phone. Okay. There are regulations which insist that each producer of the phone must put a chip in that so that government can track what the users of these phones are doing. Okay. And the purchasers of these phones, what use of they make of them is not only subject to surveillance, it is controlled. You cannot be using that phone for seditious activity, anti-national activity. Okay. If such outcomes come from the use of the phones and the government is not able to correct them, then the company which is producing those phones could also be penalized because it is not producing the right kind of outcomes. It's producing the wrong kinds of outcomes. So you have this kind of a model of an industry. Now you just replace the mobile phones here with education. You have what the National Policy on Education 2020 conceptualizes as the structure of Indian education. A whole range of entities, some of them private, some of them public, will offer these educational products. Depending upon what you can afford, you can do a 1-year course, certificate, or a 2-year advanced diploma, or a 3-year BA, or a 4-year BA. And if you can't have that, you can do online. If you can't afford even that, you do online. Okay. So it will, this whole range of products will be offered, and but the central government will retain control over what outcomes it must produce. So this process of privatization, commercialization, autonomy to institutions to decide what fees they will pay, charge their students, what they will pay their employees, what service conditions the employees have. This is the model, and with some agencies to do rating, this is really the model that the National Policy on Education 2020 is promoting. So what is this model then? So which parts of the ancient Indian traditions is this all about? In ancient India, education was the exclusive preserve of some sections of society. debarred or denied to others. That's part of ancient Indian tradition. Okay. So in ancient India, you had this reality. In ancient India, the education system, in a sense, was part of a whole setup to establish the rule of the king as being important for the social order, maintaining the social order. In that social order, there were some who had the right to do intellectual pursuit, education. There were those who had the right to rule. But for the large majority, they had to do some or the other occupation or vocation. That's what this policy is also talking about. An education system you get created in which you create one section, because these highly creative jobs of the future are not going to be there in large numbers. So that's for a few elite who will go there. And for the rest, there is vocational education. You can do carpentry, you can do local crafts. All of that will be integrated into the system. Not answering the question, is the fourth industrial revolution going to allow carpentry to survive as a profession itself or not? But you have this vocation and you can try and find your own work out of that particular process. And how do you achieve that? By putting in place a system which is highly privatized, highly commercialized, where your access depends on the means that you have. But like mobile phones have reached so much of the Indian population because they are cheap, because there are basic phones which are available for a much lower cost, okay, with limited facilities that they have. In a poor country like India, mobile phones have reached 70 to 80% of the population. Well, this model will also deliver education to large sections of the population. But of course, many will have to live with basic phones, while some will get the high-end education. With that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Majumdar, for highlighting the underlying philosophical outlook of the NEP 2020 and also locating it in the larger political economy of the country. Thank you very much. Now I would call upon Professor Nanita Narayan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Saqib. And thanks, Surjit, for a very enlightening lecture with the underlying economics of the entire situation also that you have brought forward in your inimitable way. I'll try to look at it in a little more simplistic manner. And first of all, I'd like us to, I agree with what Professor Majumdar has just said about the fact that, you had so many different versions of this particular policy. And so if you just look at this, the trajectory that has been followed, it is also very clear that the last document that has been made public with 66 pages has not actually countered many of the provisions which were there in the original document. It is a summary. It, for example, talks about the sweeping powers that will be given to the boards of governors of these higher education institutions. But the details are not mentioned. So the details are there in the original draft and they have not been actually, reversed in any way. So if anybody needs to understand even the letter of the document, apart from just the underlying philosophy and the spirit, you have to go back and look at the 484-page document, which was the original Kasturi Rangan Committee report, which was brought out on the 31st of May 2019. So that's one. And so those who are looking at a few, nice sounding statements which are there all over the place, will find the word holistic and multidisciplinary and many other nice things. You will have to go back and look at the other policy, even to understand the letter of the policy. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. What I really want to focus on is, not just the background to the whole policy, what has been actually happening on the ground. I mean, the policy is not divorced from what has been happening in terms of various policies and regulations which have been coming from this government and the previous government, the kind of march towards privatization, corporatization that we have been seeing over a long period of time, this document is not a departure from that. It is, in a so that's one, the background. The second is the timing of the announcement of this particular policy. In the middle of the pandemic, when our figures of COVID affected people has crossed 20 lakhs, and the health system is, in many parts of the country has not been able to cope with this crisis, and even more, the crisis caused by the lockdown, in terms of livelihood of people, where people are desperate even to meet their needs for food. Employment has not really taken off, even where lockdown has been partially opened. The economy has ground almost, to a halt in a way, because there's so many interdependent factors, and it's not really taken off. You can see the markets are looking like ghost towns in many areas. What was the need to, instead of focusing on the problem at hand, what was the need to announce this policy at this particular point of time? That's one. The second is that if you just remember that what has been our biggest concern as teachers across the country, as students across the country, and other people in this school and university system, the biggest concern has been, just prior to the announcement of the policy, the announcement of the UGC on the 6th of July through the guideline that they brought out about mandatory provision for holding examinations for the final semester students, which was a big shock to us, because a little before that, in April, the UGC notification, while we had many reservations about some of the statements about online teaching and so on, which really didn't take off, we didn't have the preparation, the infrastructure, and the huge digital deprivation of very large sections of our population, all these problems were there. But at least it had left the matter of the final semester examination ultimately to the university concerned or to the state concerned to see how they were able to best do it, or find some other formula, perhaps like the one suggested by the UGC itself for first year and second year. That is, take the average of the earlier semesters and take the internal assessment of the semester. When we were waiting for some notification from the UGC, which we were made to believe is coming to prevent universities like Delhi University from going ahead with this complete, farce of an examination, online open book exam, which they're planning to start very soon. Court cases were also going on. 55,000 students had given a feedback from Delhi University that they will not have really not been able to access online classes, and this exam will be a farce also because there is no monitoring possible. You don't know who is going to do the exam. Tutors are being engaged to sit and do the exam for the students. So the whole thing will be a huge question mark on the credibility of the university system. All these arguments were being given, and the UGC seemed to be saying, yes, don't worry, there is a tweet from the minister and we will rethink and we will advise the university accordingly. Suddenly we have this notification on the 6th of July, which puts states which have already given degrees, like universities like Hyderabad Central University has already given degrees to its students, in a quandary. And many states have declared they cannot hold examinations at this time in the middle of this rising cases in this pandemic. When the UGC says you have to hold exams offline, online, blended, clearly because offline exams don't seem to be possible, they mean that you will have to, eventually you'll have to have this open book or whatever kind of online examination, which would be a huge problem again. One, because of the digital divide. People who are already, facing huge problems in terms of the disease itself within their families, in their neighborhood, in terms of availability of even ration, availability of space, even to be able to access any online classes, and certainly to be able to do an exam. All these are causing tremendous anxiety and trauma among our students at this time. To push us forcibly towards this online examination just didn't make any sense at all. So this was one question that we had. if we wish to understand A, the timing, and B, this, this background of what made this UGC do this U-turn, we have to really take a look at three main events, which I would like to mention here. Prior to this announcement of this national education policy, one is on the 1st of May, the Prime Minister makes a statement saying that the Kendra Bindu, that is the central sort of theme or the heart and soul of the national education policy is online education, online teaching. Soon after that, there is, I just looked up on Google various, Business World and all these papers and channels which deal with business, this kind of news that from say $3-4 billion on online education, we are going to now reach $18 billion economy for online education, for online teaching. So there is a certain boom in the business prospects of those who are invested in this field of online education. Soon after that, you have the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, announcing that he's going to invest some $4-5 million or $1 billion, and the exact figure I'm not aware of, in the Reliance, that is Ambani's online education, online teaching business. So clearly it's a matter of big business, and the pressure from big business, from the big corporates, which in any case have been dictating policy over a period of time, whether it is a question of mining or forests or water, and every matter of importance for the people of the country, it is these large corporate houses which have been dictating policy. And then the attention was turned to education, which had been offered as a commercial tradable service way back in 2005. And this clearly was seen by them as their golden opportunity to strike while the iron is hot. There is a pandemic, there's a lockdown. Universities are not functioning in the manner in which they normally do. And so this is the time when we can actually make a big killing, so to say. So the real interest behind this are the big business interests. This is one event. The second event, which is significant to me, is on the 24th of June. There is an agreement signed with the World Bank. Very small amount of investment from them. They're going to be able to dictate to the government how to formulate their courses and run school education. Never mind that the intervention of the World Bank way back in the 90s had practically destroyed our school education, where there were prescriptions along with large loans that were given, prescriptions in school education about why does government have to invest in so many teachers? Why don't you manage with 2 teachers? Why don't you manage with 1 teacher? Why can't you manage with para teachers, and so on and so forth? And the state of government schools that has followed since then is practically destroyed. And after that, thousands of government schools have been sought to be handed over to private parties. And that is one of the campaign, the struggles of university and college teachers and school teachers has been to try and prevent school education from being completely handed over to the private sector. So that is the second event. And the third event is on the 7th of July. You find that the government announces that because of the loss of time in teaching for school children, syllabi from class 9 to 12 is going to be curtailed. Certain topics will be dropped, certain chapters will be dropped because of some 30% loss. So it's very difficult to understand why that was being done when a lot of teaching was already over by March. And when did you invite suggestions for what should be dropped? The government said that we have received some 1,500 suggestions. It's quite clear. Aligned to the ruling party, which you have this intellectual foundation, that particular, body of educationists and so on. And we can see what their motives have been from the fact that the kind of topics that have been dropped are those, for example, of federalism, in India's federal structure. Second, which is clearly against Article 1(1) of the Constitution, where it says that India is a union of states. So the federal structure, which really, the right wing, which seems to be dictating these changes in our syllabi, are not very invested in the idea of federalism because they believe one supreme leader and their role models are Hitler and Mussolini, as is very clear from their writings. And secularism, the freedom struggle, also things like people's movements on climate change, on environment, on deforestation, which would then deal with the rights of our Adivasis to their forest land and the link with the preservation of our ecology, and the way in which people, why the governments are increasingly bypassing various safeguards and giving permission for deforestation and mining and all kinds of things by bypassing all these laws, getting shortcuts. So the idea of environment, also evolution, that is another topic which has been talked, Darwin's theory of evolution, because clearly many in the ruling party have openly said that they don't believe in the theory of evolution because it is not written in our scriptures, in their reading of our scriptures. So all these changes which have been brought are clearly dictating a certain kind of thinking, certain unscientific thinking. You don't really have the need to teach your students about these things, and if they don't know, and citizenship is another one. Citizenship might be aimed at the fact that there's so many anti-CAA protesters from universities across the country, and clearly their education has helped them to develop an understanding of why the changes which were brought in the law for citizenship is unconstitutional because they're based on one's religion. Don't teach them about citizenship. There is no need, then they will not, grow up with the understanding that is required, will lead to their protesting and creating, according to the government, a nuisance. And therefore, now they're being attacked and arrested and all kinds of things are being done to crush that dissent. So from the very beginning, you nip it in the bud by not teaching students about these important aspects of our country, our constitution. So these three events, I think, need to be understood as a background or as a precursor to what has come in this national education policy, which has been announced by the government. The other thing I want to get back to is that, as Surajit had said, hinted in the beginning, unfortunately, there have been some articles by very well-meaning people who otherwise are quite abreast of what is happening in education, but perhaps we should have had a deeper discussion with them, those of us who have been in the field struggling against education policy over the years. Maybe they would not have missed the wood for the trees, so to say, and not found comfort in some of the pronouncements in these policies. In fact, one of the pronouncements in the last document is, surprisingly enough, the preamble to the Constitution, which perhaps is a tribute to the fact that in the anti-CAA struggle, very large numbers of thousands of people across the country, lakhs I would say, had been focusing on the preamble to the Constitution, the values enshrined there, and holding up the Constitution, holding the national flag, singing the national anthem. So perhaps it was felt that maybe some lip service needs to be paid to the preamble to the Constitution to affirm that, that the policymakers too actually believe in our Constitution, because that was a very big question mark, which the protest had successfully managed to put in the public domain, that is this government really committed to our Constitution? But anybody can say anything. I mean, I would really say that the devil can cite scripture for his purpose. Anybody can cite aspects of the Constitution. Anybody can say very nice things about holistic and multidisciplinary, and the fact that people who can't afford to pay for education should not be kept out of education. Schools, even though the government will treat private and public schools equally and give grants to both, which is, really difficult to understand. But schools should not make profit. They should not be allowed to profiteer, and so on and so forth. All these are very nice to hear. But where are the teeth for these things? I mean, where is the legal provision for preventing profiteering? What is the legal provision for ensuring social justice, which is there, which is enshrined in our preamble? But what is the way of bringing in representation of people in education in particular? So it is very clear that there is a very big slip between the cup and the lip, so to say. It's very easy to say that this should be done. But what is your intention is clear from the fact that your legal provisions, even the most basic provision of reservation, which is the only way in which we have been able to bring about a small representation of SC and ST and much later for the OBC in our educational institutions, particularly at the level of the faculty. I mean, in fact, in our university, Delhi University, despite the provision of reservation having been there in the statute book in law, in the constitution for a very long time for SC/ST, in our university in Delhi, we started this only in 1996, and probably because post-Mandal, there was a pressure, there was an there was an awakening of one's own rights in the marginalized sections of the OBCs as well as of the SC/ST. Once again, it gave a kind of fillip to that, gave it energy, and because of which there was political pressure on our vice chancellors, who at that time some of them were considered extremely progressive, but on the question of representation of SC and ST, they were pulling their feet, I'm afraid, and we really did not have this provision till then. And even after that, it was an uphill struggle to be able to get them to implement the policy, and so we find a huge gap between what is intended and what actually happens. If you look at the figures all over the country, then the representation is actually abysmally low. And then, when the OBC reservation came in many years after the Mandal recommendations were adopted in 2007, soon after that, appointments were just stopped altogether. So most of the OBCs who were appointed in our university have come in as ad hocs, not as permanent teachers. So there is always some reason to, perhaps because as the class of rulers in this country, where we've really not been fully committed perhaps to the values enshrined in our constitution, to really bring about an egalitarian society, which is what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had envisaged. But he had said that if, along with the letter of the constitution, if the political will is not there, if the social will is not there, then all this remains on paper. And this is what largely happened. Because when, those of us who have been privileged to, really, I would say in a sense, almost colonize the country, and you can see how great the divide is. It's been sort of pushed in your face now during this pandemic after the lockdown. Otherwise, we are able to invisibilize what has happened to 90%. The conditions in which 90% of our citizens live, but it's very difficult to ignore it now. So, when it comes to implementation of policy or to making of policies, really, I think our class interest, the class interest of the rulers, clashes with logic, with justice, and class interest generally prevails. So it has been an uphill struggle. Those who have been denied their right to participate as citizens because of their denial to opportunities for education, to empowerment through education, to decent livelihood, really have had to wage the struggle more or less on their own. And the little progress that is made is then countered in so many different ways. Recently, there is this whole move to amend the creamy layer provision for OBCs and thereby deny them again. Before that, we were struggling against the roster, which was sought to be changed, which had actually been changed to a department-wise roster, which had reduced the number of posts reserved for SC/ST OBC to a very bare minimum, almost zero across the country. And then after a long struggle, it was restored back to institution-wise roster, college-wise, university-wise roster. So these are the struggles which have been continuously, going on. But in this document, there is absolutely no mention of reservation. That is one. And when you talk about access to education, they say, the policy says nobody should be denied because of not having money. But how will you ensure that? How will you ensure that fees remains reasonable? In fact, our demand has been that you should make education completely free from KG to PG, because that is the only way when people who are deprived of even the minimal livelihood of being able to get 2 square meals a day will be able to send their children into a school or a college and get a decent education. Now, let us not talk about reducing the cost. It must be zero, because their livelihood, their earnings are zero. So it is absolutely unjustified and I would say anti-people measure to put a price on education at all. But what has actually happened? What is it that you have actually done? By deregulating, one of the central themes of the national education policy is deregulation. Another theme is centralization. Some people feel that how do the two things go together? Well, they do go together, because the centralized bodies, whether it is the Shiksha Ayog, I don't think it has disappeared. It is there in the original document, and this document doesn't say that it will not be there. So you have the Shiksha Ayog, you may have state level Ayogs also, maybe headed by the Minister for Education and not the Prime Minister. But the Shiksha Ayog will oversee the process of deregulation, will oversee the process of fragmentation when you have said no affiliated colleges will be there, will oversee this vision of 3 kinds of universities, and then having to ask for accreditation, having to meet certain standards where inputs will not be taken into account anymore, which means the government funds, the provisions, the infrastructure, the appointments of teachers and so on, but only output will be seen now. And that is what are your results like and how you're doing. And divorced from the input, you can imagine the kind of biases that will be there against universities or colleges which are already deprived of funds and infrastructure, and therefore going down. And they will then be, because of that, graded accordingly and deprived of more funds. Just excuse me for a sec. Vimlesh, yahan pe mat kijiye aap. Chhod dijiye, important lecture. Sorry for that interruption. This is one of the dangers of online communication, that you can't really divorce yourself from the domestic situation, which will keep intervening in your lecture. So I was talking about this centralization and deregulation at the same time. So on one hand, you have this centralized kind of structure where all decisions will finally be dictated from the top, and there will be many national level bodies which are going directly against our federal structure. We're taking away the powers of the states where education is in the concurrent list. On the other hand, what is this deregulation actually saying? Well, if you really go back and look at the original document, that is where we in Delhi University, our alarm bell started ringing and we were shocked. I mean, and those who realized what is happening said, oh my goodness, it can't be true. This is not happening. So what it says is, of course, disaffiliation of all colleges that I just told you about. So we won't have a federal Delhi University. We will have, say, 70 colleges, and some college, each of them stand alone as a higher education institution, probably in the third type where it's an only teaching institution. University of Delhi would be, with a few maintained colleges, perhaps be one separate HEI. And like that, they have said that the current 50,000 approximately HEIs in the country will be reduced to 15,000. So you can imagine that the number will be reduced rather than any kind of expansion to meet the needs, the growing needs of the public. So in our university and in every institution, what will be the structure of governance? Today, even if we were forced to become autonomous, there would still be a UGC which dictates that, okay, these are the minimum qualifications of a teacher, these are the selection processes, these are the the student-teacher ratio that should be there, this is the kind of courses which are recognized, this is the fees that you should have. So if some institution, school or college, violates these, even a Zilla Adhikari can question it. I mean, our very active lawyer, Ashok Agarwal, takes up a whole lot of these issues where there is overcharging of fees, or the EWS is not being met, or somebody is being denied admission, or something else is happening. Once all power is given to the managements, which are called boards of governors in these institutions, then the regulation of the UGC is not there at all. Then what kind of safeguards would there be? So these BOGs, in even the 66-page document, it says that they are given all the required powers. But they very cleverly left out all the powers that they're actually given, which is there in the original document, hoping that people will, as Surajit said, miss the wood for the trees. And I'm sorry to say some people have missed the wood for the trees. So if you go back and look, the powers of the BOG are everything. I mean, they just have to give their statement or their objectives, on the website, place their aims and objectives on the website, and then they will be asked no question. They can do anything. They can decide which courses they will teach and which they will not teach. Whatever courses they have will, now they're saying in the last chapter that there will be a national curriculum framework or something, they will be within that, which will, along with the skill development council, will decide what kind of courses there will be on offer. But they have the freedom to decide which courses they can offer, which they won't offer, which is going to be profitable for them and which will not. They will have the freedom to decide what the qualifications of teachers, what the service conditions of teachers, what the fees of students will be, and so on and so forth. One thing that is laid down and which freedom the HEI will not have is that there will be no elected representation in the BOGs. It is categorically laid down in the original document, and it has not been countered in the 66-page document. So on one hand, you are going to completely do away with any kind of democratization of governance that has been achieved after long years of struggle in our universities and colleges, where in the executive council we have elected representatives in the university. Tomorrow there will be no executive council. It will be replaced by a BOG, and it shall not have elected representatives. So what will be its composition? Before I talk about the composition, I just want to mention one thing, that by taking away the right of teachers to participate in the decision making, you are actually taking away their right to speak. You have taken away their freedom of expression. And on one hand, you talk about the preamble, which talks about the liberty of thought and expression. And on the other hand, you're actually putting a lock on the mouths of teachers. If the teachers are not able to exercise their independence of thinking and articulation, what kind of independent thinking can they inculcate in the students? What quality of education can you have when you do not encourage independent thinking, and when you do not encourage freedom of expression? You will be stuck at the time when you have to just endorse whatever is perceived as knowledge till that point of time, and knowledge will never grow. You have to just say yes to whoever's in authority. You can never speak truth to power. And without that, there is no question of quality education. So all these things are contradiction in terms, as I've been pointing out, the various, the difference between what is professed and what is actually being done. So in the Board of Governors, what is even more frightening, and that is when the centralization comes in, is the composition of the Board of Governors, which is given in the original 484-page document. So in that it says that 2/3 of the Board of Governors, which may have 15 to 18 members, some such figures, will consist of the following: government representatives, which will obviously toe the government line, to the representatives of primary funders. Yes, the government clearly does not intend to remain the primary funder. So the primary funder may be somebody who has the money, some big corporate house, which will take over your institution, and because of that they will have a say in the governance, in the making of courses, in the selection of teachers, in the deciding of the fees for the courses. So the representatives of primary funders will be in the board of 2/3 of the Board of Governors, and the third will be public spirited individuals. The exact words I don't remember, but it says something. The public spirited individuals. Who will select these public spirited individuals? Well, clearly, since the only original body is the Shiksha Ayog, the Shiksha Ayog will decide who these public spirited individuals are, and this is the way in which infiltration is taking place across the board. It is this is what the way in which it will take place in the Board of Governors. Clearly, these will come with a particular ideological baggage, which is suited to the government in power at this point of time. We have the BJP and the RSS, and the way in which this lateral entry is also being brought in all spheres, in the bureaucracy, in medical institutions, in schools. This is, and even in the police, with this police mitras and so on, we saw their role during the recent riots, how they were coming without uniform with the police and throwing grenades and so on in these, the period leading up to the Northeast Delhi riots. So this is the kind of infiltration that is being sought to be imposed on our universities. So these 2/3 will then dictate all policies, because the 1/3 will not have elected the remaining 1/3 will not have elected representatives, and that 1/3 will be nominated by those 2/3 from within the institution. And whether they will be able to whether they will want to stand up to them, or will they be able to stand up to the 2/3 in matters of, say, dismissal of a teacher, or removing a course altogether, say history is just no need for history to be taught, so let's remove history altogether, and or let us not teach the freedom struggle, or whatever you may want to do, or make the fees into lakhs, because that is the only way you can pay back the loans that you're taking from the market and make the institution financially viable. The 1/3 may not be happy with this, many of these decisions, but they will clearly not cut any ice in the face of the 2/3 of the Board of Governors. So this is what is most frightening to all of us. That what will be our service conditions post this? Well, it says very clearly that the original document, that the salaries will not be made any less, but it doesn't say that they will get any increase. Will there be increments? Will there be promotions? Will there be pension? And will there be even your job? I mean, that is not clear, that whether you will remain in your job. If you are there in your job, your salary will not be made less. But will you continue to be employed? That is not clear. In fact, there is a system of compensation amount being decided by the BOG. Compensation clearly is for loss of jobs. And so there is this system of, a provision perhaps for when all decisions can be taken by them, then they can certainly decide that they don't need you, and that you're a liability, or your department is a liability, and we are changing our policy, and so on and so forth. You can give differential pays to different people, even if they have the same qualifications and have the same seniority. Even if they're junior, they can get a higher salary because they're more useful. You will evaluate the teachers, you will monitor them, how much money are they bringing in, how successful are they, in terms of whatever goals you have in terms of output, and you will not make permanent appointments. You have a tenure track is mentioned even in the 66 page. In the earlier document, it said that you will have at least a 5-year probation, and all these things had been like alarm bells for teachers, and that is why we have been opposing this policy all along. Certain things will be dictated to us. We will not have the freedom. The 4-year undergraduate program, which we have suffered in our university and struggle to get rid of it, will be imposed across the country. And this entry-exit business, well, it is clearly more the emphasis is more on the exit, because when your universities are already chock-a-block full, you don't have space to sit, especially after the 54% increase after 2007 OBC admissions, OBC quota. We really, in many institutions, do not have even place to make the students sit during an exam. They're sitting in the canteen and all over the place. We have 200 people in each classroom. Nobody at the back can hear anything that the teacher is saying, even with the mic. So things are already pretty bad. So you don't expect lateral entry into our institutions, but you definitely expect exit. You don't expect entry at later points, but you expect a lot of exits, and they will be encouraged. There are people from marginalized sections. How are they coping? Can they manage to pay? Can they, cope with the pressures at home? Do they have to also work at the same time for the livelihood, for the income of the family, and so on and so forth? So you will find that people from SC, ST, OBC, and women in particular, and people who cannot afford to continue to pay, will be eased out. And who will be left to complete the 4-year course? The others will get these certificates, which may or may not have any value in employment, any kind of decent employment. But the ones who finish will be those who are already the most privileged to begin with. So our education system will end up enhancing the inequalities rather than reducing them. Already the system is such because these policies have been in practice for many, many years. It's not the first. Even during the UPA government, the attempt was there to push through. If you go back further in time, after 1991 liberalization and globalization, it was, again and again, we were told that higher education should pay for itself and so on. And we fought back every time. And we were able to fight back successfully in some cases. We fought back the 6 bills in Parliament, which was, one of them was doing away with the UGC, and then there was the accreditation bill and so on. Because at that time, at least we had a chance to say our piece. We were not called anti-national for giving our dissent. We were not put behind bars or attacked for being critical of government policy. We did face different kinds of victimization. We did when we opposed the 4-year program in Delhi University, but we were not completely made voiceless. We had the media, we had the judiciary to turn to, and we were not divided amongst ourselves because of communalization across the board. So that government was not able to crush people's movements in the way in which this government is able to do, because it has some additional weapons in its arsenal. But these policies have been sought to be imposed, not only on us in our country, but across the world. And in many countries, they were successful right from the time of semesterization. In the US of A, post the Vietnam War, after which student movements have been very rare. They have not really succeeded in the universities after that. Semesterization came in, they had to take loans to study, they were busy repaying loans. And in Europe, because of strong student movements, public funded education has been protected to some extent. But in our country, as you see, government after government was being pressurized by the neoliberal agenda of corporate forces, global corporate forces, to bring in these changes. The offer to WTO for putting higher education under the GATS as a commercial tradable service was made in 2005. And subsequently, you can see all the changes were made as per the rules of business. That education is a business. It's no longer, as per our founding fathers, a way of bringing about emancipation, participation of people in the life of the country, real democratization of our country, empowering of citizens. After all, they have a right to be to get the benefits and to decide how the money that they give to the government through indirect taxation is going to be used, but the policies are not being made for their benefit. So just like the public sector has been sought to be privatized, and so many public sector units which were doing really well have been ruined first and put into red, and then they're sought to be completely crushed and finished, and there is massive layoffs going on there. Now it is education which is facing the brunt, not from now but for many years. And this, according to me, would be the final nail in the coffin. Not just according to me, but this is something we've been debating for quite some time in our joint forum for movement on education, which has FedCUTA and AI Facto as the representative bodies of central and state universities and colleges, and all the school teacher all India organizations, many students organizations, organizations like the All India Forum for Right to Education, All India Safe Education Committee, the All India People Science Network, and the BGVS. All of us have been debating these policies for some time, and this is our unanimous view that this would really be the last nail. It would be, of course, then we'll see how we fight against these changes as and when they are implemented. But once governance goes out of your hands, our unions would become defunct, because when you're an autonomous institution, the DUTA would really not have any meaning. We have not been able to intervene in institutions which were taken out of our university and made into autonomous institutions in any manner. So we can see what the future holds. Tomorrow, if our students are, if large sections of our population are kept out of the pale of education and of higher education. I have not spoken much about school education because I think we're really running out of time, but the similar sort of non-formalization, merger, closure, and bringing in those who are in the mohalla, the most educated, unko le aao, social workers ko le aao, ekal vidyalay ko role de do in taking over, filling the gap between what you need and what you have. And when you say that you're going to have ECCE, elementary continuing education, focusing on the ages of 3 to 6, we can understand where are the personnel. Your teachers training institutions are in a shambles. Your 11, 12 lakhs posts of teachers are lying vacant. So clearly this will be done with social workers, with philanthropists who are filling in the gap instead of PPP, as Professor Anil Sadgopal says, that P in the middle is no longer private, but it's both private and philanthropic. And philanthropic means you can get your tax rebates through your corporate social responsibility. The big business houses can invest and then also dictate terms by being present in our boards of governors and dictating terms on all matters. So this marriage of alliance between the right wing and this neoliberal forces, which has been developing over a period of time, they are clearly a much better instrument of implementation rather than a Congress or a UPA, which could not achieve that degree of communalization or fragmentation of people's resistance, which this government has been able to do. So they're able to crush the people's voices and be able to push through these policies in a much more authoritarian and vicious manner. And that is why it is much more dangerous. Tomorrow, we may not be able to have this kind of discussion if our jobs are on the line, if our freedom is on the line. How many people will speak out? Will students develop the kind of understanding that we saw through the anti-CA protests, and because of which they are now being targeted? Will they even get that kind of training and knowledge and education to be able to develop those kinds of analyses? That is the question. And we have to be very afraid of this whole policy. It is, if you just look at the icing on the cake and not look at the poison within, then we will be making a fatal mistake. As I said, that it's like we have seen the wolf dressed up as the grandmother over a period of time, and if now the wolf has come in nice new clothes of the grandmother and is talking sweetly to us, and we keep saying that grandmother, why are your eyes so big? We have to understand that this eye stage is over long ago. It is now the teeth. Grandmother, why are your teeth so big? We know why. They have come to eat us with it, and therefore we should not lose sight of the entire history of our struggle in this whole period, and the loss of our constitutional values, our plural culture, our diversity, our values of social justice and freedom of liberty of expression and articulation, and our federal structure. Everything is now up for grabs, and another agenda is being implemented. This marriage of convenience between the right wing and neoliberal forces is not peculiar to our country. You can see it across the world, in the US of A, where you have the white supremacists, and and that's why persons like Trump get elected. You see it in Brazil, you see it in so many countries. So what is happening to us is not peculiar to us. And while the onslaught is globalized, the resistance, unfortunately, is still not globalized. But we have to not only get ourselves together in our country, we have to also look across the borders to what is happening in other countries and come together to fight this onslaught on the fundamental rights of people across the world. And I think with that, maybe I don't have much time. There were a few other points I might have liked to mention, but I think I'll stop here. And if there are any questions later on, I will be happy to share my understanding on those matters.
Thank you, Professor Narayan. You tried to link the NEP with what's happening on the ground, particularly the push towards privatization and commercialization. We also see that the changes happening also suggest an ideological agenda of a particular kind under this regime. And there also seems to be a pattern of centralization and deregulation happening at the same time. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Aishi Ghosh, President of the JNU Students Union.
Thank you, Anveshan, for having me for this panel. I think so. Professor Surajit and Professor Nandita has quite well explained the philosophy, the politics, which is there behind. And whoever is watching this video, this is a request. Like, whatever I have been continuously talking about NEP, I have been saying that please don't detach the government understanding or the BJP, what its ideology is, what it has done in the past years about education, from suddenly this policy document. Like correctly, as Surajit sir also said that this is not moreover a political document rather than a policy document. And even why do I agree to this so much? Because when we see a policy document, what we expected was, even as a student community, that after 34 years when a policy document is coming, what we expected in 2019 when the draft was public, that this document will try to identify the loopholes that was there in the last 34 years, what the education system couldn't do, where the education system couldn't reach, why is the literacy rate so low, why there are so much of dropouts among the caste lines, or why there is kind of discriminations happening on the gender lines, what are the infrastructure or academic options or inclusiveness the people are not, or the children are not able to get. And then we thought that this document will try to give a kind of framework that how do we move ahead. That is what a policy document is supposed to do: analyze the loopholes, suggest this is the fund, these are the loopholes we are going to identify, and then these are the places we are going to increase. Now this document clearly, if I say, is a very neatly drafted, sugar coated, as Nandita ma'am was also saying that the poison is inside, and Upar said so well neatly said that it is trying to actually appease, and I would use that word, and suddenly give a false hope to a certain section of the country at this moment. And there we saw in the initial days when the draft came was in 2019. There were 65,000 response at one go when it went in the very initial months. And then we saw in last 1 year, more than responses, 2 lakh responses going to the MHRD. Many student organizations, we met with delegation to the MHRD ministers, and we tried to point out what are the problems. Now, the certain problems that we have clearly said is three, that obviously it is commercializing, communalizing, and centralizing. This document is centralizing. We see how Parliament doesn't even discuss about this document before finally passing it, how it doesn't even ask the state governments what their opinion about this document is. Secondly, when they said different citizens, student organizations, students, teachers to give their valuable opinions about this draft last year, we didn't see much change happening in this, like at all any change, if we say in specific words, happening into this document. And it was clearly passed on. We don't know how, what is happening. So this is not a new thing. It's only happening with the NEP. There are many decisions in the last 1-2 years we have seen, especially in the second term when this government BJP has come leading, that they are passing on anything without even getting approved or discussing these in the floor and everything. But what is clearly disappointing, and as much it is expected and disappointing also, that how sugar coated dropouts are being made in this document, which is really going to push the maximum younger generation of this sort into more of uncertainty towards education. Like on one point, we are talking about right to education, which clearly has to state that how our education system will be inclusive for the maximum people, and how we will reach out to the every corner of the country to make sure education reaches to everyone. At the same document, what more is being talked about, that there is a easy go. Even yesterday when the Prime Minister was addressing the nation, what his major focus was that students जब पढ़ना चाहते हैं, जब इस डिग्री से निकलना चाहते हैं, so it's the way the easy flow is going. It's clearly understood that when the 480 pages document came also, the matter is they are saying that students can drop out. Why do students drop out? Dropout is not a choice, is something that they are not trying to understand. This document is not accepting the fact that dropout has never been a choice for many. Many people were forced to drop out from the education system, and what were the reasons for these dropouts has not been addressed in this at all. Now, one more thing that is very given in this document is how schools will be merged. Like as we know that many of these schools, according to earlier provisions, were told that they should be in 1 kilometer distance, and school should be there at distances where students can access school education and everything. And now we see how they are saying that if less than a certain number of people, 30, 50 people, we can merge the schools and shift them to, so that the number of students be more in one school, and let's not have a lot of schools. Now we have to understand that there are a lot of spaces, lot of areas where there are students who are not able to travel a lot because of financial issues or structural or societal like issues. So now what are those students going to do suddenly? Is the government just thinking of reducing the amount of infrastructure or spending, and what is the thought behind to just reduce the number of schools? If we have to reach that goal of imparting education to all, on one hand we can't have this secondary option of just merging of schools anyhow and everyhow, and just not knowing the fact that why are students getting dropped out. Like it can't be not without a reason that in the closest area of ours there is a school maybe, and we see there is an enrollment of 100. So the maybe what they are saying that the gross enrollment we will be reached to a percentage, particular percentage. But what is the guarantee that the gross enrollment, which in maybe is 100 in particular school, remains 100 throughout the year, and they are able to access that education throughout, and they will get something out of that? Because what is happening in between is, once the enrollment is 100 and then we see 50 students are dropping out, and then the school is left with only 50 students, the government might say that let's stop the school and merge it with the some far by school together, because there are very less students and we can't spend enough of funds on running a school with only 30 or 40 children. So now what the enrollment data shows is something else, but actually what is happening in the ground is something else. What happens to those 50 school students who are forced to maybe drop out because of societal or gender discrimination or anything? Also, if we see the document very carefully and we type down the words that I was personally trying to search out, there is no mention about gender discriminations. In parts and ways, it talks about discrimination, and there is no specific talking about the how the gender sensitization committee against sexual harassment, like institutions like this, should be brought up more. Like the document in 21st century doesn't talk about these issues about discrimination based on caste lines, how reservations will be ensured, what are the ways that these kind of discriminations can be helped, and what are the futuristic way that they're seeing that the LGBTQ plus community can be involved more and made more inclusive into this system. Nothing of that sort. Also, this thing of registrars being appointed now by the government, and the board of governors will have specialized people as board of governors. Now who these people are, and this faceless survey by the higher authorities and everything, obviously makes this more what to say exactly is, makes this more difficult in a way that students first of all could reach out to different systemic ways, which now will be quite away from students. They are focusing exactly how Nandita ma'am also said before, that the Prime Minister is continuously focusing, and yesterday's speech also was all about online access, online classes and online ways, open learning and online learning. So these online learning platforms have been very quickly taken up by the business institutions and corporate houses, how they have started advertising it well. Also, the document mentions how academic bank credit will be given. So that is also a very interesting thing. So in a way, now they are saying that even if you want to have online classes, you don't need to worry. You will all have access to bank loans, which will provide you with smartphones. You can buy smartphones, laptops. But what has been clearly said in this document is how we are entering into a more debt cycle, where we will have more loan and loan. Like initially we had seen that to study in certain institutions, how many parents had to take loans for their children. So now from the school level to the research institution level, they are like through the STARS project, how we saw they took huge amount of loan. And this is nothing that is not happening in the ground. To the viewers, I would say, as soon as the NEP came into being and everything, already the JNU, like this is an example from JNU, the JNU administration already was talking about this. But we saw that how quickly and everything the HEFA, Higher Education Funding Agency, granted a loan to JNU administration to build on infrastructure and online setting up of things. So we have seen that how these loans are being taken, students are not being consulted, teachers are not being consulted, no statutory bodies are being maintained, teachers are not being, representatives being called for meetings where they can give their ideas also to how can we make our education system inclusive. And tomorrow we might see when the semester comes, our fees might be hiked so much that many of the students eventually have to drop out, because to continue in an education system with paying lakhs of rupees a semester is just not possible for many students to just continue their research degrees and all. And obviously this new thing that they are trying to push in is vocational training for from class 6 onwards, and internships and everything. So if you hear, if any one of us here, it sounds very interesting and exciting if we see that, okay, internships will be there. Already we have seen that how during this whole pandemic we have seen, if we take example of medical interns, how they have been exploited in a way. They have done work for 17 to 20 hours and they have been paid like not only under wage, it has been pathetically under wage. They have not been given their minimal wages and everything. These are there. Along with that, we have seen how they are talking about training at the age of 11 or 12 years, but without a framework that who is going to specify what kind of training these are. What about students coming on from these suburban, rural areas? What kind of trainings are they going to get? What is the kind of training are they talking about? Subjects like humanities and the kind of subject, different forms of subjects they have, and what is the age, like at the age that a student would be at that moment is some 11 to 12 years old. So what kind of vocational training are we talking about, and all these, because extracurricular activity is a very different thing that was already part of school curriculum, we know, every one of us. But these kind of vocational trainings and this absurd comparison of the Indian education system and the percentages with the US and the South Korean population, which is like if we read that document, we might feel nostalgic and we might feel, okay, we can reach the limits of the sky within maybe a year, but that's not going to happen, because so many years before also the Kothari Commission and every other commission were talking about having the education budget 6% GDP. Until in 2020, we are talking about that. Not much has happened. So we can, like, to put it in short, if we see that this document, like, obviously we all wanted a national education policy. We always obviously we wanted the government to rework on it, make it more inclusive. But we have seen that there is a very less of scientific and rational understanding of this document. How it is more like every paragraph ends with one line, if anybody sees it, that this step has been taken because we will be having a more Indian cultural ethos imbibed in this. We are taking this because. So the crux of the whole document is to just induce the Indian cultural ethos. But also let's question that what cultural ethos? Like how they have brought in the language thing. So if we see that India as a country is very diverse, we have, even in a state, we don't have one dialect of a language. There are different dialects according to changing regions. So if we even study in that particular dialect, if we have our native languages in our schools, in the coming days, what will happen? This is a clear target. This language debate again has made it sure, because some 5-6 days before an article came where private schools were asked principals that are you going to change into the native languages that in the city you are located, and the private schools denied. So the private schools will continue with English as a medium of education, and who all can go to private schools and bear the cost, we know. And the government schools have already started in certain states. In Telegraph it came 3 days before. Certain states have already started saying that we will be teaching in the native languages. So there will be a huge difference between students coming on from different areas. And very importantly, this divide is going to impact the next coming generations huge. Like, there is no wrong in learning your mother tongue or native languages, but the way they are trying to institutionalize the divide is going to be problematic in the coming days, because there are so many languages. People might get education in so many languages in their native community languages. So obviously, already parents have started talking that rather than teaching in their native language, it's better let's switch over to Hindi. At least Hindi will be useful in every state we go to. So this is also a slow process of pushing the this language into a framework where parents, rather than like where I come from, Bengal, people are already thinking that rather than teaching Bengali, where will my child go and speak Bengali other than the state? So it's better that we teach Hindi in place of that. So that will be, at least she or he will be able to communicate later. So these are the ways, slowly and subconsciously, they are trying to push the language also in a way. And as a whole, if we obviously analyze the process obviously had been to communalize education a lot. The way like focus has been given to religious learning, and clean sheet has been given to like religious learnings can be there and such kind of institutions. We have to understand, standing in the 21st century, a government should have, and the policy document should have been more scientific. It should have been specifying that how can we have more of a common system in schooling so that nobody gets deprived from education system. The younger generation doesn't get just pushed out of the education system. But we see just a contrary thing to happen. Like, for initially it might look like it's going to bring a lot of change, but the coming days will be really difficult. The coming days, the kind of centralization they are trying to bring, obviously the spaces of unionization, the spaces, whether it's to teachers, students, are going to reduce like anything. Obviously judiciary is not always coming into our like, we can't always have the judiciary beside us to give positive responses to such things or judgments to the thing. Like what happened in Delhi University, we know already that the court has said that it can go ahead with open book examination despite so many protests happening, students continuously trying to say what are the issues. And so that is a way that how our education system has been tried to be ruined and made more robot, like I don't know, made more mechanical, in a way where critical thinking is not at all encouraged, where students obviously will be somewhat suffocated even in this system. That obviously the ones who are coming from the marginalized community will have no option but to have an easy exit out of the system, and the women and everyone have facing a lot of issues. So this is it, like in a crux. I wanted to say, I wouldn't extend it much more because I think so Professor Surajit and Nandita ma'am has covered a maximum of the points. So I just wanted to say all these points about the language and the communalization that they are trying to push in, and also the students of last point that I would be liking to end with, that we can see already the students in NIFT and students in DTU, they have been started to protest in the last 3-4 days regarding the fee structure during this health crisis. They have been asked to pay some lakhs of rupees within a week, which is putting huge pressure on the students. They are in distress. We have got a lot of calls from them that how can we help them, or any legal ways if the things are known. The time is obviously crucial. It's the time of the health crisis, and obviously the BJP is choosing this time so that we can't organize ourselves. But it will be a very important time ahead, that how we can ensure that such policies, we can resist such policies in the coming days. We can prepare a framework where we can help resisting these policies in the coming days. So thank you.